March 9, 1997. That's the day hip-hop lost a legend. Just 24 years old, the Notorious B.I.G. was taken way too soon. Biggie's death wasn't just a loss, it was a gut punch to the hip-hop world. It came only months after Tupac Shakur's tragic passing. Two giants of the game gone within a year. It was like losing the heartbeat of a whole generation of talent, and the pain cut deep. Even now, decades later, the wounds haven't fully healed. And the questions, they've never stopped. Who killed Biggie? Why did they do it? And will we ever know the truth? Over the years, theories have piled up, accusations have flown, and speculation has run wild, but no one has ever been held accountable. One name, though, keeps coming up in those conversations: Wardell Faust, better known as Poochie. This guy had a reputation that preceded him, one of pure menace, the type of person who could freeze a room with just a glance, commanding silence without saying a word. Wherever he went, tension followed like a shadow. People didn't have to ask who he was, they already knew. He was trouble. He was a feared member of the mob Piru Bloods, a gang rooted in California, but notorious nationwide. Suge Knight, who would later become a close friend, was also affiliated with this blood set. Born in Kentucky, Faust moved to Compton with his family, trading one unstable environment for another. His mother's remarriage after divorcing his biological father added another layer of unpredictability to his early years. But Poochie's life began spiraling into darkness early. By the age of 14, his temper and violent tendencies were already well known. After losing a fight to a neighborhood kid, Poochie didn't just let it go. That night, Mrs. Johnson was sitting in her living room when she heard an explosion. A shotgun blast. As she peered out the window, she caught sight of a car speeding away. Her home wasn't spared. The address plaque was riddled with holes, and stray pellets had punched through, embedding themselves inside. It was Poochie. He'd fired the shot in retaliation. In court, his story shifted as fast as his mood. First, he denied being involved. Then he admitted to the crime, standing there as though it were just another Tuesday. The contradictions didn't matter. His reputation had already begun to take form. And yet, it was his stepfather who ended up taking the fall, setting a pattern in Poochie's life where others often paid the price for his violent choices. By the late 80s, Poochie had transformed into a figure to be feared. His notoriety only grew after the murder of a rival gang member, OG Stoney, in broad daylight. Witnesses described how Poochie casually walked up to Stoney and shot him in the head, unflinching, before disappearing into the chaos of the street. As the years went on, Poochie's crimes escalated. By 1991, he and his stepbrother were suspected of being involved in a nightmarish home invasion in San Bernardino. The crime wasn't just a robbery, it was a massacre. The intruders murdered a man, shot his girlfriend in the head, and left her for dead. 4 children were in the house, helpless witnesses to the carnage. The girlfriend survived, but the scars, physical and emotional, were permanent. In 1994, Poochie found himself face to face with law enforcement again. Reggie Wright Jr., who would later run security for Death Row Records, arrested him for possession of a pound of white stuff and an assault weapon. By now, Poochie had become a seasoned criminal with an air of professionalism. While others in Suge Knight's orbit were swept up in the fame and chaos of Death Row's rise, Poochie was different. He stayed in the shadows, careful and calculating. Photographs of him were rare, and when they did surface, he made sure his face wasn't well seen. It was as if he knew invisibility was his greatest weapon. By 1995, his reputation wasn't just that of a gang member, it was that of a hitman. That October, William Rat Dog Ratcliffe, a young rapper from Compton, learned just how dangerous Poochie could be. Ratcliffe had been chasing a record deal with Death Row Records, but his approach was anything but smooth. At a video shoot, he cornered Suge Knight in a bathroom, pressing him aggressively for an opportunity. Tensions exploded shortly after when Ratcliffe's crew clashed violently with Suge's entourage in the valet area of a Marriott near LAX. The bad blood was clear, and the whispers started almost immediately. Suge Knight wanted Ratcliffe gone. For Suge, disrespect was intolerable. According to the rumors, he didn't hesitate. He called on Poochie, his go-to enforcer, and gave a direct order: handle it. The next day, Ratcliffe was gunned down in broad daylight. When word of the killing reached Suge, his response was chillingly simple. He doesn't mess around. That's how I want him to do it. The hit only solidified Poochie's role as Night's trusted fixer, the man who handled the messes no one else could or would. His name carried weight, whispered in conversations filled with fear. By then, Poochie had allegedly been tied to multiple murders, including that of another rival known as Smoothie. Like Ratcliffe, Smoothie's death was rumored to be at Shuge's request, further cementing Poochie's place as Death Row's silent enforcer. Fast forward to 1997. Biggie was in Los Angeles pushing his new album Life After Death and filming a music video. Just days before the release, he sat for a radio interview, his tone unusually serious. He admitted he was worried about his safety, especially after Tupac's murder and the tension between the East Coast and West Coast rap scenes. He wasn't taking chances. He'd hired extra security, fully aware of how dangerous things had gotten. That weekend was packed for Biggie. He hit the Soul Train Music Awards, presenting an award to Tony Braxton. The plan was to fly to London the next day, but instead, he ended up at a star-studded after-party hosted by Vibe magazine. It was the kind of party where the guest list read like a music industry who's who. Faith Evans, Queen Latifah, Aaliyah. Even members of rival gangs, Bloods and Crips, mingled under the same roof. Over 1,000 people filled the venue at the Peterson Automotive Museum. The energy was electric, but for some, it also felt tense. Early that morning, March 9th, 1997, around 12:30 a.m., Biggie and his crew left the party. They were rolling in 2 SUVs, with Biggie sitting in the front passenger seat of one vehicle. Puffy and his entourage followed in the second car. Behind them, a security detail trailed closely, just in case. They cruised through LA, the city quiet in the early hours. Then, it happened. At a red light, Biggie's SUV came to a stop. A dark Chevy Impala SS pulled up beside them. Before anyone could react, the driver of the Impala rolled down his window and opened fire. Bullets tore through the air, shattering the calm of the night. It was over in seconds. In the SUV behind, Puffy shouted for his driver to slow down just as the gunshots rang out. Everyone ducked instinctively, bracing for the worst. As the Impala sped off, Puffy's driver, Kenny Story, whipped the car around and raced back to where Biggie's SUV sat frozen at the light. Puffy jumped out and ran to Biggie's door. He flung it open and saw Biggie slumped in his seat, his face frozen in shock like he couldn't believe what had just gone down. Puffy later said, "I was trying to talk to him, but he wasn't saying anything, like he couldn't hear me." Puffy tried pulling Biggie out of the car, but couldn't. He was too heavy. There was no time to wait for an ambulance. They needed to move. The driver sped off toward the hospital, Biggie still silent and unresponsive in his seat. In the car behind, Paul Offord and Reggie Blaylock had a front row seat to the chaos. Blaylock, an off-duty cop, instantly noticed the Impala pulling up beside Biggie's car. He saw the driver, a lighter-skinned man, with his arms stretched out the window holding a gun. The shots came quick. Blaylock ducked, but then looked up to catch the Impala speeding off. He gave chase, but the rented Blazer he was in couldn't keep up. It was capped by a speed limiter. As they raced to the hospital, Kenny Story, head of security, was replaying everything in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off that night. At the party, he'd noticed a man in the parking garage just standing there watching. The guy looked like he might have been gang affiliated, but Story brushed it off at the time. Now he couldn't help but wonder if that man had been part of it. He knew questions were coming, and he knew fingers would point his way. The ride to the hospital was madness. A woman in the back seat was screaming, cursing and yelling directions, trying to guide them through the streets as they sped through the night. When they finally pulled up to the hospital, D-Rock jumped out of the car, running inside, shouting for help. The paramedics rushed out, but when they saw Biggie, they stopped. He was massive, and they had to go back inside for extra help. It took 6 men to lift him out of the SUV and onto a gurney. Something about it felt eerie. For a shooting, there wasn't as much blood as you'd expect. The bullets had hit in a way that sealed the wounds, trapping the blood inside his body. He wasn't bleeding externally, but he was losing blood rapidly internally. The doctors worked on him for over 20 minutes, doing everything they could, but it wasn't enough. In the ER, Puffy dropped to his knees, praying. Lil Cease stood beside him, crying uncontrollably. The room was packed. Faith Evans was there, her face etched with disbelief. Everyone waited, holding onto a shred of hope. Then the doctor walked in. He didn't need to say much. The news hit like a hammer. Biggie was gone. The time was 1:15 a.m. The autopsy later revealed the heartbreaking details. 3 of the bullets weren't fatal. 1 hit his arm, another his back, and a third grazed his thigh. But the 4th bullet, it was the killer. It entered through his right hip, ripping through his organs and hitting his heart and lungs. It was over before anyone could do anything. After Biggie was killed, the streets were buzzing with speculation, tying his murder to Tupac's death just 6 months earlier. The 2 rappers had started out as friends, but everything changed after Tupac was shot in 1994. Tupac felt betrayed, believing Biggie knew more than he let on. What followed was the infamous East Coast-West Coast rivalry with Biggie and Puffy on one side and Tupac and Suge Knight on the other. It wasn't just music, it was personal, and everyone could feel the tension in the air. Rumors started swirling that Biggie might have had something to do with Tupac's murder, but no real evidence ever surfaced. As for who killed Tupac, most theories pointed to Orlando Anderson, a Crip who had gotten into a fight with Tupac in Vegas that same night. Others whispered about Suge Knight, Tupac's boss at Death Row Records, being behind both murders. Suge's name always seemed to linger whenever blood was spilled. When Biggie was gunned down, a few reporters speculated that a Crip might have been responsible, possibly over some personal beef rather than gang politics. But like so many stories in LA, the case hit a wall. No arrests, no charges, just more questions. Detective Russell Poole, one of the lead investigators, wasn't buying the surface-level theories. He thought Suge Knight was pulling the strings. Poole suspected Suge hired David Mack, a dirty LAPD cop, to take Biggie out. Poole pushed his findings up the chain, but his bosses weren't trying to hear it. Blocked at every turn, Poole eventually left the force, frustrated and defeated. Years later, journalist Randall Sullivan wrote a book called Labyrinth, laying out Poole's theory in detail. According to Sullivan, Suge Knight worked with Mack to orchestrate Biggie's murder. The book also suggested another potential suspect, Amir Muhammad, who fit the description of the shooter. Sullivan's claims added fuel to the fire, making an already chaotic case even messier. David Mack, the LAPD officer Poole pointed to, was no stranger to controversy. He was knee-deep in the Rampart police corruption scandal, accused of running with gangsters and committing crimes on the side. And then there was the detail that made everything stick. Mack owned a black Impala, the same type of car used in Biggie's murder. The name Amir Muhammad also kept popping up thanks to a jailhouse informant known as Psycho Mike. Muhammad had been loosely tied to the case through sketchy testimony, but things never quite added up. Nick Broomfield's documentary, Biggie and Tupac, ran with these theories, but it was heavily criticized for being too speculative and not digging deep enough. The motive they suggested, that Biggie's murder was a cover-up for Tupac's death, just didn't hold much weight. Biggie's mother, Valletta Wallace, wasn't going to sit back and wait for answers. She filed a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles, claiming the LAPD had all the evidence they needed to arrest the killers, but didn't act. Initially, David Mack and Amir Muhammad were named in the lawsuit, but they were later dropped as defendants. The case still moved forward, but just before trial, a major witness, Kevin Hackey, folded. He admitted that he'd lied under pressure from Wallace's lawyers, and his retraction gutted the case. Then, in a dramatic twist, the plaintiff's lawyer got a mysterious call from someone claiming to be an LAPD officer. This caller said there was hidden evidence in Biggie's case, evidence that could break it wide open. Sure enough, there was a stash of undisclosed files that hadn't been brought to light. Among them was information that could have changed the trajectory of the investigation. Rolling Stone even dropped a bombshell article accusing the LAPD of botching the case, possibly because Puffy had interfered. The Los Angeles Times hit back, calling the piece sloppy journalism. The author, Randall Sullivan, clapped back, accusing the Times of being part of the cover-up. It became a media circus, with accusations flying in every direction. The Times didn't help its own case either. 2 conflicting articles came out from different sections of the paper. One piece from the Metro desk backed up Poole's claims, connecting the murder to the Rampart scandal and publishing a photo of Amir Muhammad as the alleged shooter. But another article from the business section revealed that Muhammad was alive, well, and working at a brokerage firm. To make matters worse, his ad was running in the same newspaper. Muhammad wasn't about to let it slide. He called out the Times for their mistake, demanding they clear his name. After some resistance, the paper issued a correction, but the damage was already done. His name was forever tied to a crime he claimed he had nothing to do with. Another blow to the Pool Sullivan theory came when journalist Chuck Phillips exposed flaws in the informant Psycho Mike's testimony. Turns out his information wasn't as solid as everyone thought, further shaking the case's foundation. In 2006, the investigation was reopened, and Detective Greg Kading took over, hoping to piece together a case that had been broken for years. Detective Greg Kading believed Suge Knight planned the hit on Biggie as retaliation for Tupac's murder and to maintain his image as a feared figure in the streets. Rumors swirled that Suge had even paid off corrupt LAPD officers to keep his name out of it. But what made the story even more twisted was the involvement of one of Suge's baby mothers. She was initially part of the plot but had a change of heart and went to the police, adding a shocking twist to an already convoluted tale. Leading the investigation into Biggie's murder, Kading uncovered startling details that pointed straight to Suge. Even from behind bars, Suge allegedly managed to pull the strings. The testimony of Teresa Swan, one of Suge's former girlfriends, became a turning point in the case. She claimed Suge ordered the hit and used her as a middleman to deliver the message and the money to his hitman, Poochie. According to her, Suge offered $25,000 to have Biggie killed. It might not have been a fortune, but in their world, it was enough to get the job done. Teresa's life was as much a mystery as the crime itself. From her appearance to her role in Suge's empire, she was a chameleon, changing her image to fit whatever the situation demanded. Sometimes she appeared as a glamorous party girl, other times as a hardened street figure. Her relationship with Suge went far beyond romance. She was his right hand, managing errands, deals, and even his personal affairs. She knew how to navigate his dangerous world, but that loyalty had limits. Detective Kading's investigation revealed how Teresa, acting on Suge's orders, contacted Poochie to arrange the hit. People close to Knight and Poochie confirmed they shared a special, secretive bond. Mob James, a former death row associate, described Poochie as the guy you called when something needed to be done. He was quiet, calculating, and deadly. Kading's team leaned on Teresa's legal troubles to pressure her into cooperating. Faced with the threat of jail, she agreed to work with investigators and even wore a wire during a meeting with Knight. But Suge, ever cautious, quickly caught on. When Teresa brought up Biggie, he shut the conversation down, denying any involvement. Despite the failed wiretap, her testimony corroborated key elements of Kading's case, helping to confirm suspicions about Suge's role. Teresa's cooperation earned her immunity, but she disappeared from the public eye soon after. Knight likely knew she had worked with law enforcement, but harming her would have brought unwanted attention. Even Knight, despite his reputation, knew where to draw the line. Detective Kading believed the LAPD had little interest in officially solving Biggie's murder. He suspected they feared reopening old wounds, especially with allegations of police corruption tied to the case. Frustrated by the lack of progress and internal politics, Kading left the force, but not before making copies of the evidence he had painstakingly gathered. He later detailed his findings in his book Murder Rap, revealing the tangled web of lies, betrayal, and violence that surrounded Biggie's death. Kading felt a responsibility to share the truth, especially for Biggie's mother, Valletta Wallace, who had spent years seeking justice for her son. Valletta believed the LAPD knew the truth, but was covering it up to protect someone powerful. Each anniversary of Biggie's death was a painful reminder of the justice that remained out of reach. 3 years after Biggie's murder, Poochie himself became a victim of the violence he had once wielded so easily. In 2000, he was ambushed in a car with a friend. Poochie survived, but his friend wasn't as lucky. The case, like Biggie's, went unsolved. In 2003, Poochie's story came to an end. While riding his motorcycle through Compton, he was gunned down in a drive-by. His death carried the same eerie silence that surrounded so many in his world. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no answers. For someone who had spent years living by the gun, his fate seemed almost inevitable. In the streets where loyalty shifted as quickly as the wind, it wasn't surprising that someone he once trusted may have been the one to turn on him. That's how it went in their world. One day you were on top, the next day you were a target.